Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for joining this morning's webinar on homeschooling. To start with, I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Poppy Dundas, a client manager at Keystone Tutors, and I help to organise all of our homeschooling programmes. I'm joined by Ed Richardson, Keystone's Director of Education. We've worked together for several years now on a variety of homeschooling programmes. We are also joined by Andy Thompson, Education Consultant and Director of Oxford Myrtle Education. Andy has spent his career in independent education and was head of one of the leading tutorial colleges in Oxford for many years. He is also a consultant to the Independent Schools Association. We work closely with Andy with a few of our homeschooling families, and so today we'll be hearing his thoughts on homeschooling as a concept and the benefits that this can provide. I'm just going to launch a quick poll, which would be fantastic if you could all answer whilst we're just continuing this introduction. In the webinar today, we're going to address several of the most common questions on homeschooling, and we'll give you a bit more of an idea of how we as Keystone can help. We'll hope to cover a variety of topics, but there is also the chance to ask any questions that you may have, so please do ask those as we go along, and we will attempt to answer all of them. Fantastic. So to begin, Andy, given that you represent quite a few homeschooling clients, it'd be helpful if you could talk us through the main reasons that families come to you in need of homeschooling.
Thank you very much, Poppy, and good morning, everybody. Well, I would say that over the years, it's become more varied. I think if I were to go back to the beginning of my career, I would say that things were very clear cut, that even in the 80s, schools were still quite rigid organisations. And where a child ran into difficulties, while there might be sympathy and support from an individual teacher, often the institution as a whole was not so geared up to assist. And so parents found themselves with obviously a very frustrated child at home, spreading deep unhappiness across the family. And then a kind of Rubicon was crossed where a parent might decide, I will homeschool. And that, of course, at the time could mean a massive demand on a family, in terms of suddenly having to become, expert in a range of subjects in a short space of time. And of course, with much more limited resource in those days than is the case today. And obviously there could be a lot of anger and antipathy at a time like that, a feeling that school had failed. I will remember a name maybe not so big on the TV screens these days, but an actress who was greatly revered and loved in the 70s and 80s, a lady called Susan Hampshire, and she had been dyslexic at school, and she wrote passionately about the lack of understanding and the degree that she was treated as if she was some kind of idiot back in the sort of 50s and 60s. And while things were changing in the early part of my career, I don't think they changed greatly. Things have changed an awful lot, and an awful lot for the better. And so we've seen children with learning difficulties supported much more. We've seen children that just don't quite fit supported a lot more in recent years. So I would say that what's really happened in the last 10 years or so is that parents choose homeschooling and have much more of a range of tools at their, as resources for them to go to. So it might be that I take on a little bit of the schooling for my child. It might be that I enlist the support of a tutor. It might be that I enlist an organisation like Keystone, and together we can produce more of a mosaic. And in that sense, I think that it's much more collaborative these days. So once a parent or a child encounters a problem, there are many ways of looking at it and thinking about it. And what we call homeschooling might not involve 100% of the time at home, which it certainly would have a while ago.
Fantastic, thank you. And we've had the results of the poll, which was asking when you would consider starting homeschooling. And actually there's a real mix here. Some think that the start of the academic year is the best time, many are undecided, and then often people want to begin it in the middle or during the next academic year at some point, which does show there's a real range when people are considering this option. Great, so going on to Ed, if you were a new parent coming to Keystone or a new family, could you maybe talk through the process of what you would expect and how we would begin that sort of starting the homeschooling?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Poppy. I think the first thing is we need to establish the situation of the family. So it may be the case that the family are coming to homeschooling because they're new to the country, It may equally be that they're coming to it because of a particular reason, so school isn't working out, but equally there are some families that choose to homeschool for a variety of reasons. It's an option that they prefer as opposed to an option that is forced upon them. So I think we need to establish where they're coming from, what their kind of reasons are for homeschooling, and then to work out whether we can sort of align ourselves to support whatever they're looking for. So what we try to determine is the kind of goal. So in the vast majority of cases where we support, students are going to reintegrate back into school at some point. And I would say almost all of the cases. There are some instances where students are being homeschooled by choice and they will continue to be so. And we perhaps are providing a subject which the parent or parents can't provide or are struggling to provide. And we would sort of bolster their homeschooling provision. But once we've kind of determined what the goal is, we would then look to build a platform, or sort of a program, as it were, around them. And this would be based on their age, their level, and obviously the goal. So for example, if someone to join us in year 6, we might be thinking about what school they're going to, senior school they might be looking to enter, perhaps in year 9, or indeed in year 7, depending on the timeline. So I think we'd always start with an initial conversation to try and work out the situation of the family, what they're looking for from homeschooling, what the goals and aspirations are for their children, and then whether or not we can support that. And I think we try to be as honest as possible, because although homeschooling can be fantastic in the sense of having a tutor one-to-one with a student, it is limited, and I'm sure we'll discuss those limitations in a bit, but we look to try and communicate what we can and can't do, the limitations, but also the benefits of homeschooling, which again I'm sure we'll discuss today, and then determine the best route forward. But as you know very well, with every situation it's different. So the number of subjects we cover, the amount of contact time they have, all of these sorts of things, will be specific to the family, but also specific to the individual. If we have multiple children within a family, it might not be that one size fits all. So that's the beauty, I guess, in some ways.
Yeah. Fantastic. We've had a question come in asking if homeschooling is only for those who have had negative experiences at school, or could it be a positive option even for those who are actually doing fine or quite enjoying school? So I wondered if you could discuss that.
Yes, Poppy, I think the answer to that is yes. I suppose I began by perhaps thinking about some of the more negative situations that have occurred, largely because they put pressure on families. I think, yes, it's perfectly possible to consider it as a positive experience. We've seen schools try and do this, for example, more and more in their curriculum as children get older, in terms of the IB as an option, which encourages students to think about learning in the context of other things and a general life experience. And that can be something that parents might be thinking about for their children, that we do want them to be book smart, but more than anything, we want that intelligence, that academic intelligence, to take a place in the world. So I have had queries from parents that say, we're actually going to take a year out and we're going to spend a certain amount of time traveling, and we'd like to do have some academic support along the way as well. So yeah, I think there can be many reasons why that's done. I think Ed really touched on something there when it's the key to the whole thing. Ed said every situation is different. And I think once we identify situation, we go to child. What is in the interest of this child, this learner, as we move forward? But yes, there could be an array of things that affect the family. For example, at a college in Oxford years ago, I looked after the boy who was the son of a Grand Prix racing driver. Now that pretty much meant they were a circus family. They moved around a lot. And placing him at schools had not been so productive. So the idea of having a roadshow of tutors that could do things in holidays or a certain amount, obviously going back a little bit, online contact a little bit more limited, but there were ways and ways of working and building around that. And we made an incredibly positive experience as he moved forward into A-levels. So yeah, certainly from my side, yeah, many reasons.
Fantastic. And just going back to what Ed was discussing, we've had another question asking what the difference is between homeschooling and just having 1 or 2 tutors to support the key subjects. So Ed, I wonder if you could comment.
I think it's a tricky one because, I mean, homeschooling, the definition, I've not looked it up actually, but I would suggest that the definition of homeschooling would be something along the lines of the majority of your education being provided outside of a formal school context. That's what I would suggest it might be, but please don't hold me to that. What's the difference between, for example, doing your A-levels at school and then also doing an additional A-level alongside, because your school won't allow you to do a 5th A-level or a 6th A-level or a particular A-level in a subject which perhaps they don't have teachers for? Well, fundamentally, in the context of that one subject, yes, you are being homeschooled, but in the grand scheme of your education, you're obviously at school. So do you think it's difficult to define, because obviously every situation is different, but where you're receiving the majority of your education outside of a formal context, and I would classify formal context as school, I would imagine that at a sort of government level, you would be classified as somebody that is being homeschooled. And so, yeah, there are obviously going to be people that are somewhere in between, in the sort of grey area potentially. And indeed, as you know, we've worked with many students who are kind of in and out of school, but we're supporting them with their learning as well. So we're actually working in tandem with the school, because they're not in the school for enough time. We're sort of topping up what they're missing when they're away. So I guess there is sort of absolutely homeschooling where you're not receiving education in any other setting. There's kind of hybrids in between where you might be in and out of school. That could be for a medical, social, emotional reason that you may not be able to access school. It also could be because you've relocated to the UK recently and they don't have space for certain reasons. So you could be kind of in between. And then I guess that the kind of more shallow ends of it, in terms of homeschooling light, it could be that you just decide to do an additional subject in which your parents or your carers or yourself indeed are trying to manage that experience, to ensure that you're able to sit the exam, have worked out where you can do that. Maybe you can do that at your current school, but kind of doing all of the kind of logistics around preparing, or it could be that you're doing something and learning something for absolutely your own reasons. You don't have to necessarily be doing an exam in it. You could just be learning something outside in a really kind of concentrated and focused way. So there is a range, but I would say the definition probably in terms of the conversation we're having are where the majority of students would be receiving the large part of their education outside of a formal context, or outside of the school.
I think that was really why I made the point I made at the beginning, that you go back 30 years, it was rigid. You were at school or you weren't. So homeschooling would very much correspond to your first conception of what it is, that you're at home with mum and dad, and everything takes place within the family unit. But no, we're talking about many shades in between, which is why that anybody considering homeschooling can start to think about it, the engagement of an agency like Keystone's, the engagement of individual tutors, and so on.
Fantastic, thank you. So Andy, I wondered if you could now expand on the support that you provide as a consultant working with Keystone. You obviously help us with several of the families who are now being homeschooled. So if you could talk us through how you help from your side of things.
I think just first of all, Poppy, and I think, I know all the wonderful work you all do at Keystone. I think the first thing is just saying to everybody, it's cool to stop. It's okay just to stop and look. Because obviously modern education, I think we over-examine the children. I think they are subject to immense scrutiny that places great demands on them from quite an early age, and certainly once you get into senior schooling. And so it's important to say it's okay to stop, and it's not the end of the world to stop and look and think. And I think in doing all of that, it's natural for me then to want to hear it from the young person and want to hear their version of things and how they see things, and to say to them that I'm not looking to take a decision. I'm not looking to say, oh, well, you've said that, so we'll seize on that and you should go back to school and we should organise things there, or yes, we should definitely stop. Just genuinely trying to understand and trying to offer professional advice to give the family the chance to explore things in every conceivable way so that we can decide on what to do. If the circumstances are positive, then things are really good at school. So we want what replaces that to be positive as well. We don't want to break anything. If something is conceived to be broken at the moment, we don't want to make it worse. So we want to start by saying, okay, where are we? And what would be the thing to do in moving forward? And there is always time and room. There is always time and room, because once you address a concern for a family, then come up with a plan that genuinely works, you know that you will then move forward much, much more positively and productively. So any time lost will then be gained. And, you know, the biggest thing for me with a child that's taken up homeschooling in some shape or form is seeing that extra bit of confidence that's coming in, that excitement about the future, that generation, that forward movement, which is what we're all about.
Fantastic, thank you. We've had another question come in about how universities would perceive homeschooling applications. And I guess this also works with schools. If you were to have a few years out as a homeschooled student, how would a school perceive that when you're trying to enter back in?
Happy to jump in there, Poppy, if you want.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of concern about this, but actually the reality is that I think most schools and universities are sensitive to the situation of each individual. When you apply to university, there's a reference written on your behalf, which extols your kind of virtues and I guess your capability to study at undergraduate level. And so that reference is going to perhaps reference, you know, a period of time where you've not been in school or along those lines. I've known of homeschoolers that have applied to the most academic universities and successfully won places. So I don't think you're in any way I don't think you're in any way affected by it necessarily. And I do think there's a concern that a lot of people, worry that homeschooling, because it's unconventional, perhaps, or it's deemed to be or thought to be, then that might be one of the reasons as to why. But I think it's important to know that it's a growing number of people that are being homeschooled. I think the last report that I saw was between sort of 60 and 80,000 students are being homeschooled in the UK. So, you know, that's a lot of students, and as a consequence, it's not going to be that unusual then, therefore, for somebody to be applying to university. So I would personally, and we've worked with people before who've been in these sort of situations, I think it's important that you reference it. I don't think you hide it. And indeed, actually, you will have benefited. There will be some skills that you might have. You might be more independent. You might be able to demonstrate more skills than perhaps your school-based counterparts. So as a consequence, I would look to try and turn what could be perceived as a negative into a positive.
Yeah, I echo all of that, Ed. I mean, I spend a lot of my life on university entrance. Needless to say, having worked in the tutorial sector in Oxford, it's one of the biggest things. I think many parents think I've actually got an escape hatch into the university in my office here in Oxford, and it's because it's not like that. At the end of the day, only one thing matters about applying to university. How do I, as a young person, connect to the course I am about to do next? If you get that right, if your skills and interests combine with that course, that is all that matters, and everything else that you want to talk about in your past will feed into that channel and will make sense. Universities are open-minded, and as Ed rightly says, there is no point in ever trying to disguise anything. If you go into a university course with something disguised, you will feel uncomfortable and you will worry about your presence there, and it will make 3-4 years of study very, very difficult. Universities are, in my experience, the most open-minded institutions in UK education.
Fantastic, thank you.
And I'd say schools are very willing to look at a student. I guess what the key question they're going to be asking is, if someone's reintegrating having been homeschooled, is two things. One is, academically, are they able to integrate? And is this socially and in terms of their character the right place for them? And if it is, that I don't think there's going to be too many concerns asked, and indeed we've got lots of experience of where that's been the case.
Fantastic. We've also had another question about any legal barriers to homeschooling. Can some local authorities make it difficult for families if you want to homeschool, and what are the sort of procedures you need to go through if you are going to choose to homeschool? Don't know if Andy or Ed.
Well, certainly yes. I mean, obviously there is a legal requirement to be schooled in an appropriate way up to the age of 16 when one can leave school. Obviously, what you do in sixth form is really nobody's business. Obviously, schools are inspected on their sixth forms because we expect certain standards to be met. But in terms of the obligation to be there, everything terminates at 16 when children are effectively grown up and can go into the workplace. So yes, local authorities will want to know what educational provision is being made, but it is perfectly possible to present a programme of homeschooling for the approval of a local authority, or indeed, the work being provided by tutors. anything to add to that?
No, I think, I mean, it's a really, really good question, that, and I think it's something that if anyone is considering homeschooling, it's absolutely something that you need to be addressing straight up. I think in the vast majority of cases, it's under a parent or carer's jurisdiction to be able to educate their child. They're in control of that. The key that the government want to see is that you're doing that appropriately. And what that basically means is, according to their age, according to, you are educating them in the appropriate kind of curriculum, as it were. So they're receiving a full and sort of rich diet of learning, as it were. And I think as long as you're covering those bases, I think invariably you are doing as the government would ask you to do, as the responsible person in that child's life. I think what we've had experience of where local education authorities have come and asked, because they've asked the parent what is happening, and invariably what they've just wanted from the tutors is sort of a scheme of work. They've wanted to see, does that match the national curriculum? Is that kind of appropriate? Is it balanced? And it tends to be quite light touch, surprisingly so. I expected in some instances that it'd be more probing, but obviously in a natural setup anyway, you'd hope that you've got a scheme of work, you understand where you're trying to get to, A to B, and you can be able to communicate that with ease. And obviously tutors, whether they're through an agency or privately, they should be able to do that because they'll be doing that with you as families anyway. And so therefore, I think when LEAs do get in touch, local education authorities or people who are responsible in authorities for basically inquiring about students that are not in school full time, they'll invariably ask, what are they covering? How does that align with their age and their peers within school? And it's normally quite a sort of a simple form to fill in to do that. One other point is, I think you are obliged to register that. So you're obliged to acknowledge that this is the choice that you've made. So I think that's an important point. One thing I would say is that I think the question may be alluding to, are there differences between the way councils or local education authorities approach homeschooling? The answer to that is, I would say yes, in my experience. There are some councils that are much more on it than others in terms of the questions they may or may not ask. But I have read certainly of situations where there are some councils that are more probing than others potentially. But as I said, this is the responsibility of the parent to acknowledge that homeschooling is something they're doing. But in terms of the government guidelines, to my understanding anyway, it's the responsibility of the parent to ensure their child is being educated appropriately.
Yeah, I'd agree with Ed on that. I certainly had a lot of experience of children who've been homeschooled across different local authorities, because we ran extensive Easter revision courses that would attract children from all around the UK. I never heard a negative experience that a parent or a child had. That basically, when local authorities came in, they found that the children were more than meeting the educational requirements. Why? Because I think parents do consider this very, very carefully. And if anything, parents are anxious that they'll be missing things. And the net effect is that the educational component tends to move much faster, and there tends to be much more of a connect with the child because the child is learning their way. Obviously, the other concerns around homeschooling come into play about the exposure to a wider community. They're not the kind of things that a local authority is looking at. They're looking at the fact that the child basically isn't paying truant.
Fantastic, thank you. I wondered if we could now move on to the main benefits of homeschooling. There are obviously non-academic and academic benefits to this choice. So if Ed, maybe you want to begin on the non-academic benefits, then Andy could pick up on the academic benefits.
So I'm really going to talk to our experience that we've had at Keystone, because obviously I appreciate there'll probably be a myriad of benefits that maybe we've not even seen. So please don't suggest that my list is exhaustive or complete. I think confidence is absolutely something that we've experienced. A lot of students that come to homeschooling are often low on confidence. As I said, invariably people that are coming to Keystone for tutoring, it is because of a social, emotional, medical sort of issue, and that is preventing them from being in school full time. So their confidence is often quite low. And I think one thing that working with one-to-one in a sort of safe, encouraging environment which is very different, obviously, to the classroom of, you know, a group of 30 or 15 or 20 or whatever it might be. I think one thing we've definitely seen is sort of character benefits, which I think they become more confident for sure. And we've definitely seen that, haven't we, Poppy, over the time that they're with us. They start often as sort of very apprehensive and then often leave us, you know, much more confident and capable of interacting with others. I think there's another benefit, is that they also, not to say they weren't able to interact with adults necessarily when they joined us, but obviously given the kind of environment that they tend to have typically with homeschooling, in that their tutors will be adults, myself, you, they'll interact with a lot of different people. I think that those interactions are really positive in terms of their ability to kind of communicate, to express their views, to kind of hold conversations, and also to sort of take more ownership over their own learning, because they're aware that we're really just focused on that, and there isn't the kind of bureaucracy that often is around school life. So I do think their kind of confidence, but in conversation, and their ability to interact with adults, I think is and have effective working relationships is you know, really emboldened and strengthened. So I would say confidence is a big factor in terms of a benefit. And the other point I would make is probably a love of learning, although I appreciate that Andy's probably going to talk about the academic, but okay. And I just think that sort of there's opportunity, because you're going one-to-one. Often you can move through content more quickly, you often have more time, and as a consequence you can deliver the content in a context which is appropriate for the child and meaningful for them. And so I think that connection that they'll have with their learning, we have found, I'm sure it can't always be the case in homeschooling, as it's not always the case in schools, but we found that to be a really big positive, that they may have come saying, well, I really don't like English, and they've left saying, actually, I quite like this subject now, and I might choose it as an option for for A level or something like that. So that connection with subjects, obviously through the individual that's working with them, I think has been another significant positive.
Fantastic. So Andy, do you want to pick up on a few of the academic?
Well, I very much pick up on Ed's word, confidence, and I think I'd say, you know, just to make a slight distinction in that confidence in yourself. And by that, I mean, not just a sort of a general greater confidence with the world, which is very apparent with these children, but a confidence in themselves that they can find answers to things. And I think that does come from the real interaction. As Ed said, it's actually quite possible to rocket through certain things in a syllabus with a young person when it's home-based, one-to-one. Equally, when you run into a problem, there are any number of ways of solving the problem in the way that the young person understands. And I think that diversity of approach is something that is less possible in a school environment, where a teacher may be looking across at a young person thinking, I actually want to talk to you about that, but there's not time right now. And so all of that goes. One of the things that often makes me laugh is with homeschoolers, when we get to things like university, and where there are quite a few universities these days that will want to interview or have very interactive open days, and they say, can you give me some interview practice? And I say, why do you need that? What do you think you're doing every day? You've got all this engagement with grown-ups all the time. It's just more of the same. And they often don't realize how capable they are. And possibly because they're not in that bigger environment of a school, so they don't quite realize how good they're becoming. I think the chance to genuinely explore syllabus, to genuinely make the choices that you want to make, both in terms of subject and also topic areas. You know, one of the things, for example, that I hear from GCSE historians is, oh no, more Nazi Germany. You know, because obviously schools do it very well, the teacher's been teaching it forever, whereas with a homeschooler, you can often, a historian can turn around and say, what do you find interesting? Well, actually, that's kind of interesting because I saw a program on TV. Okay, let's do that. So being able to make earlier choices in syllabus that then, as Ed says, start to make you more of a person in control of your learning, which then obviously radiates through A-level, through IB, whatever they do in sixth form, and of course really comes into play at university, where relatively early on, especially for arts and humanities students, you will be making your choices about what you want to learn about. So yeah, I think lots of academic benefits within it. The biggest thing for parents is, I think the loveliest thing anybody's ever said to me was a mum saying about 15 years ago, I've got my son back. I've got my son back. And that, what more can any parent want to hear?
Yeah.
I would just add in, I would say that independence is a key skill that we often see, or a key quality that often tends to improve when they start with us. As I said, most people who do start with us tend to not be opting for it for a particular reason. It's more to do with homeschooling is because they can't be in school. They tend to lack independence. They as an academic, but also as an individual, they're not able to do a lot of things for themselves. And I think one thing that we do see, and even for those that choose homeschooling, what we do see is they are quite independent characters. They're able to manage workloads, timelines. They typically, I think that develops hugely, because the expectation is you've got to go away and do your homework. There's not set homework time, or this is something you've got to do, and you've got to manage that yourself, and timelines as well. So I don't know whether that's because you're stripping away everything else that school provides, and as a consequence you're shining a real light on, you know, the lesson, the teaching, and then the follow-up, and therefore it means that because you're simplifying it in some ways, students are able to focus in more detail. But I definitely think that characters that we engage with become more independent, and obviously that's linked directly to confidence. They're able and willing to do more on their own, and I think that's a huge positive, because I think it means that when they move into their new environment, whatever that might be post homeschooling, they tend to be pretty strong self-starters, which I think is a huge advantage. And I said this in terms of UCAS and universities and things like that. These are the sorts of skills that universities would want to see. They want to see students that are able to be independent in an academic context. And I think often, I'm not saying always, but often homeschoolers, I think one of the big benefits is that they do become increasingly dependent, and obviously that builds with their confidence, with their interest in their learning as well.
Fantastic. Just to say, we are getting all of the questions which are coming through, and we will get to them throughout this hour, so please do keep submitting. I wanted to now move on to the potentially negative impacts of homeschooling, and especially focusing on the worry many parents might have of sort of social side of things. Would the child become isolated without being at school? And as well as, would you recommend sort of extracurricular activities alongside the schooling that Keystone can provide?
So I definitely think that the kind of rhetoric generally is that homeschooling has negative impacts in terms of interaction with others, because obviously invariably it is one-to-one, but not always. I think that's an important distinction to make, though, is that there are some communities that homeschool, for example, and they come together as groups. So it's like a school, or, you know, but they're coming together for particular things. It may be science teaching, it may be a language, it may be something where you may need to do sort of a practical or some sort of engaged activity, and as a consequence having others is really important to that. And I know there are big homeschooling communities around the UK, so whilst we're talking from our experience, which is often one-to-one, I think it's important to reference that homeschooling more widely, and I know that there are a lot of active homeschooling communities which parents, if they're interested or could engage, you know, there are these places there, and a quick Google search I think can identify quite a few of them. Yes, I think socially, obviously, one of the wonderful things about school is when you go through the school gates, you've got people around you immediately, so you're interacting with lots of different people. Importantly, your own age or close to your own age. Now, it's not that within homeschooling, either if you go to, let's say, a company like Keystone, you go to their offices to have lessons in a classroom, or you're having people come to your home. It's not that you're interacting with less people necessarily. It's just more that it's the interaction with children of your own age, and that idea of collaborative learning and experiences and navigation of just education. So I definitely think it's important for parents to expose children to their peer group, to other children. It's not something that we offer, obviously we wish we could. And those experiences in which they can engage with activities, etc., with others, I think is a really important point, because it develops social skills. It means that, you know, when they do, if they want to perhaps go on to university, for example, where they will have to engage with a lot more people, that they're able to do that successfully. So yes, I agree that it is an issue in homeschooling insofar as that it takes a lot more organisation to think about these things. But I don't think it's necessarily a negative of it. I just think it means that you need to be the planning around exposure and collaborative events with peers, I think just takes a little bit more time and effort, and there are opportunities. I know of some children, for example, who, you know, in some contexts have gone to school but for the extracurricular side of it, but have been academically taught in a homeschooling environment, because some schools there is that ability to be able to do that, or perhaps they were originally a pupil at the school full-time and now are kind of only part-time. So I definitely think it is incumbent on families to provide sort of social engagement, and obviously that is a massive part of school, making friends, engaging with your peers, but it is possible in a homeschooling environment. It just, I think, takes quite a lot more time and effort to organise, and obviously that is one of the great things about schools is it's all on one site. So we've definitely encountered that, haven't we, families that have put together really enriched social programs alongside the academic, but I think it has taken quite a lot of drive and effort from their perspective.
Do you have examples of the sorts of things families would like to look to do alongside the academic side of things?
So I think parents can use school as a notion, as a sort of a rough timetable. So I think in schools we try to give them exercise, we try to ensure that they're so physically in a health related way, that they're exposed to those elements. I think there's also the notion of kind of music, drama, arts, but also then just simple activities. It could be anything from horse riding to playing tennis, but there are groups. In London, it's quite common that children do sports clubs outside of school. And so as a consequence, homeschoolers could just join those clubs. You know, for example, the number of little animal acronyms for football teams on Saturday mornings in parks is unbelievable. Little foxes, little owls, little badgers, etc. So if you had a student who was really keen on football, but obviously wasn't in school and therefore not be able to represent the school team, it's actually very common that children in schools are actually playing for clubs or as I said, sort of organisations that are not joined to school. So I think there's lots of sporting opportunity, and I think the more difficult one is the cultural sort of artistic ones. Obviously music, yes, lessons, you can do that. That's obviously more of a one-to-one environment, but often those sort of drama, arts, but things like Stagecoach, they're fantastic organisations to join and to engage with. So there are lots of opportunities. It just takes, I think, a little bit more time to find them, but they do exist, and I think it's just about doing your homework and preparation. If homeschooling is something you think that is right for your child.
I think it's also true to say, Ed, that, you know, my experience of Keystone is that you will often say, okay, actually the tuition is quite flexible. So if you've got these activities in, tell us and we'll build the academics around that. So rather than the academics driving everything, the academics are very supportive. Yeah, I think that the big danger inevitably is the bubble, and the bubble turning into an echo chamber. I think the only really bad instance I had was about 15, 20 years ago, a parent that came to me and said, all schools are wrong, we're right. And this rigid ideological approach that this genius that their child had could only be nurtured in the homeschool environment. And that's the one occasion when I've looked at parents and thought, you know, there are so many approaches to parenting, and we all have our own struggles in our families and to get things right. But I actually looked and thought, you are wrong. As parents, you are wrong, and this is concerning. But that is so rare to encounter something like that. The virtues of the bubble are a kind of pit stop effect. Often children are extremely happy at the beginning of school when they first go, and then school gets bigger and wider and more challenging, and that can lead to wanting to make decisions to move out to homeschooling for positive or for negative reasons. And that homeschooling moment is then back to that beginning again, that first encounter of learning, and that sense of something that's about me and an exciting moment in life. So the bubble is hugely important for getting everything right and started again. But immediately we are starting to think to the wider world, because we want these children to go to universities and not homeschool for university, because that's a complete experience in itself, and then outwards into life, into careers and all the rest of it. So it's a negotiation. It's a constant negotiation of both things. What's happening for me that's perfect and pristine within the tuition? What happens outside of that? And again, to go back to Ed's point about confidence, the confidence to move outside of that little domain that's been created. So as long as you are watching that and vigilant and responding all the time, it's good.
Poppy, one thing I would say is that in light of COVID-19, I think there's been an awful lot of free resources that have been produced and published, activities, even online social engagements for particular things in the world of arts and craft and things like that. So I think there are a huge number of opportunities out there. I guess the point I'm essentially making is that I think, one, you've got to engage them, as Andy says. You've got to get out there and do it and see the value and the importance of it, because ultimately young people have got to go out into the wide world and interact with others, and they need to develop the skills to be able to do that successfully. And the second point is that it just takes a little bit more time. Just because obviously schools are adept, they have personnel in charge of organising the activities and opportunities that are available to their students, and often, if you take independent schools, these are often USPs, marketing points of reference to attract parents in, saying, you know, we do this, and this, and that's a sort of supposedly a selling point. So I think it's I think there are lots of opportunities out there. I think I can see Sheridan has shared sort of Outward Bound. There are lots of opportunities out there where children can get involved in an array of different activities. So if you are being homeschooled, then you can easily supplement the socialization. So I wouldn't classify it as a negative necessarily. I just think it does require quite a lot of forethought and preparation.
Fantastic, thank you. Ed, we've had a question about students who are in exam years, so year 11 or year 13, and how that would work with homeschooling. And I guess it also applies if your child is coming up to 13 plus or 11 plus, any big exam years.
So I guess my question would be, what have they done in year 10 and year 12? Because obviously they will have done half the course invariably. If they haven't, then there's a slight difference. But I think if you're halfway through your learning of an exam, a set of exams, then it's really important to try and unpick where you're going to sit your exams, how much of the content you've covered, you know, what is the role of the tutor in relation to what the role of the teacher was when you were at school, if you've perhaps moved out of school between year 12 and year 13. So it's ensuring that there's a sort of seamless link between those two things. It's often quite tricky because there'll be things like coursework, controlled assessment, which may have been done or needed to be done. And in a tutoring environment, these things are often a little bit more precarious, they need a little bit more thought. So I think in those sorts of scenarios, what we tend to recommend is that parents maintain really strong contact with their existing school, because often they'll be registered as an exam candidate there typically. And then what we tend to do is kind of communicate with the school as much as possible, the teachers that have been teaching them through perhaps the first year of that exam sequence, let's say in year 10 or year 12. And then we can get a sense of where they've got up to in kind of working towards where they need to be. And then they would go back to school and sit the exam. That's not to say that you have to do that, because I know for some students that's just not possible. They can't go back to school. They might have significant anxiety associated with that, or it's just not a possibility. Perhaps the school hasn't offered that. There are lots of independent test centres in and around London, but also around the UK, Oxford, Cambridge, in the major cities typically, where you can go and register as an independent candidate and sit your examinations there, you know, in a normal world. And obviously this year, those independent candidates unfortunately haven't been able to do that. And there are a whole host of issues around those independent candidates and expected grades and things that have been released this year. But I would say that in the first instance, what we would look to try and do is to work out, what have you done, where are you up to, and how are you going to sit these exams. Once that has been determined, and that will probably be quite a lot of homework on the parent side, on the carer side, to organise how that is going to work. Then obviously it's about teaching the content of the curriculum, which most tutors, irrespective of them being at Keystone, should be able to do. And then obviously off you go. But I think you've really got to get those logistics set, because you've got to meet deadlines, you've got to meet expectations of the examination board and the examination centre. So it's very important that they're identified. One thing I would say is, if you do make that transition and you decide that, you know, you're actually coming at A-level and you want to do it in 1 year, that is possible. A lot of sixth form colleges in London, but also around in Oxford and Cambridge, they will offer 1 year intensive GCSEs or A-level programmes. And indeed, independent candidates could do GCSEs or A-levels in 1 year. So, you know, there are lots of options out there. So if, for example, year 10 or year 12 wasn't very good, or, you know, it was a pretty difficult year for the student, it's not all is lost. You know, that there are opportunities to recoup that time potentially. The one thing I would say is, though, intensive courses, you know, they need to be treated with caution, because the expectations on the student are quite high, the demands are quite high. There's a reason why we tend to deliver GCSEs and A-levels over 2 years, because we like to give balance and ample time for preparation. So if you're trying to expedite that, that there are going to be added pressures, and that may cause that may not go well with the homeschooler, or the reason why they're homeschooling. So it is absolutely possible, but the key thing, I think, is trying to work back from the goal they're working towards. And in the cases that you've just described, they're all exams. So be trying to work out how they're going to be sat, when they're going to be sat, and you know, what kind of criteria do we need to meet, which will be set by the exam board, but also crucially set by the test centre where you're going to sit those exams.
Yeah, I mean, just to absolutely, Ed, and I think just the core issue, the worry of where would the exams be. Most schools will allow you to come back and sit exams with them as you would have done. If that's not possible, then yes, a tutorial college or possibly another local school will allow it to happen. If that is proving frustrating, all you need to do is approach the exam boards, which have a much cuddlier name these days. We're all call them exam boards because it's how we think of them, but they're actually called awarding bodies. And I think that more positive name probably says everything about them. And they will put you in touch with somebody. They will do everything they can to ensure that your child can sit. And so you kind of get it from the horse's mouth at that stage, and they will actually help you. Just a couple of other points within that. Yes, you might be thinking about homeschooling year 10, year 11, and you're very focused on GCSE. It would be natural for all of us, Keystone, my consultancy, to say, okay, now let's contextualize. We are actually now starting to think about your journey to GCSE in the context of a journey to sixth form study, and in the context of a final destination at university. So at that point, we would be looking at everything that you need and that you want at GCSE. So that changes the parameters a little bit in your favor. The final thing that I want to say on this point is, anybody thinking about a change now in year 11, 12, 13, please, please, please consult, because none of us quite know how the landscape will be over this next 6 months or so. I suspect that the number of schools will make more use of year 12 AS examinations that have been dying off, because their children coming out of GCSEs will not be showing exam-based performance, and they'll want them to have experience, or universities might want to just see a little bit of an indication of how they're doing with things. I'm not saying that to frighten anybody. All I'm saying is, please, none of us really know at the moment, so do keep consulting.
Great, thank you, Andy. It's a really good point there. So we've had another question come in, whether people tend to homeschool more at primary level or at secondary level. So I'd be interested to hear both of your experiences with that, and whether there is a clear cut one way or the other. People tend to do it more.
I wouldn't say, I don't have any inclination either way, to be honest. The one thing I would say, though, is that there's this thought that at primary it matters less, because obviously there's not any big examinations, or you know, it's not so much of an issue. The only thing I would say to that is that it's very important that their core subjects, English, maths, their literacy, their numeracy, are tip top, because obviously they are the foundations upon which they're going to develop the rest of their learning. So I think, yeah, we've experienced, haven't we, sort of, you know, all ages, and so I don't think there's necessarily a kind of an optimum or a most popular time. One thing I'd say is, if you were going to homeschool, it's something you wanted to do because you wanted to make that choice, and you thought it might be quite, you perhaps want to take a year out, you want to go and do something different. I do think trying to avoid key sequences in education is preferable. So deciding to go to do that year out in year 10, when you've got children in year 10, that's probably not the best way, purely because you're right at the beginning of a key sequence, the GCSE program. So if it were a choice, and we do sometimes have people who do want to do that for different reasons. They might be relocating, they might be, there are a range of different reasons to why they might need that year. It does sometimes make more sense to do that at a younger age. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to think less about the nature of the support you provide, because obviously, you know, they are learning many of the fundamentals they're going to need, or upon which, you know, the rest of their learning, you know, at senior school level is going to be built on. So I don't think we've had necessarily an age group that necessarily has been it's not better at one or the other. I would say in terms of frequency, I do think sometimes in that GCSE period, particularly when children are changing both physiologically, I do think school can be quite difficult in year 9 and 10, potentially 11, and we probably have seen more numbers at that age. But as I said, if I was choosing, I don't think that would be the time that I would choose necessarily to homeschool, only because I would try to avoid key exam sequences. Purely because, as Andy says, these, unfortunately, in the way the British system is set up, these are rites of passage that ultimately, are going to be quite important if you do want to go on to university, etc. It doesn't define you. I would just say that, if you want to go through to university, etc., you will need GCSEs, you probably will need A levels. You'll need these things, and as a consequence, it's important to reference those and acknowledge their importance.
Yeah, I mean, in my experience, I'd say that a number of parents make a key philosophical, familial choice early on that I don't think my little one is very happy at school, so let's take the whole show on ourselves. That's one sort of strand, and the other strand, starts to be that their child is older and able to articulate difficulties, or our difficulties become more visible, and there are key focal points of examination, and at that point that decision is taken to, okay, we actually want to make a shift. And it's kind of more reactive decisions. I'd say those are the two sorts of, the sort of two peaks of it.
Great.
Well, one thing I would say, if you're considering homeschooling for any particular reason, if it's something the school isn't doing, I would definitely make sure that I'm having that conversation with the school first before I went down the homeschooling route. Because I think schools, having worked as a teacher myself, and I know Andy's run schools, there is a degree of flexibility sometimes, and more than maybe you might think. And they also may not appreciate or be aware of the difficulties you may or may not be having. And so as a consequence, I do think I would entertain that process of conversation first before I went down the homeschooling route. You absolutely fair enough to investigate them at the same time. But I do think I'd want to make sure that every stone had been unturned, before I went down the homeschooling route, because, it may be that school can adapt or change. And as I said, and as Andy's alluded to, I think schools are more flexible in some ways now than they ever have been.
Yeah, fantastic. Now, does the tutor, if they're homeschooling, do they have any responsibility if they become aware of issues around the care or the treatment of the child from the parents or guardians? Obviously, in a school, this would be taken care of. How would that work in terms of homeschooling?
Absolutely. I mean, anyone who's working with young people, sorry, Andy, just jump in there on a safeguarding point, but anyone working with young people, they have a responsibility and a duty of care to alert the necessary bodies, people, that might be local education authorities, that could be, you might ring and make a complaint. The NSPCC have a wonderful 24-hour helpline where you can ring and you can lodge a safeguarding concern with them. Obviously, in the most extreme case, and I don't know quite necessarily what the question is thinking about, but if it was the most extreme case, you'd ring the police or the emergency services. So I definitely think anyone who is working in that environment and has concerns about the child for any reason, it could be parents and guardians, but equally it could be for any other reason, their mental health, their well-being, etc. I think it's really important to raise those and to the necessary, if you're an independent tutor, it may be that you want to ring. I think the NSPCC helpline is a really great helpline to be aware of and to speak to. And it may be that if you're working for an organisation, then they will have a point of contact, a sort of safeguarding point. And invariably that person will then again engage safeguarding experts, because, although they may be trained, they're probably not necessarily experts. Absolutely. So I think to answer the question, yes, they do have a responsibility to ensure that they raise those questions.
Yeah, I'd say the two things from a parental point of view. I mean, on a very basic level, while obviously there's no professional barriers to making yourself a tutor, obviously tutors often come to parents through recommendation from other people, and they will be bringing the appropriate government paperwork, the criminal records check that's now called a DBS. And they'll be very happy to show you that. Beyond that, there is a contact at every local authority called the LADO, the Local Authority Designated Officer, and they are there to answer any queries or to respond to any issue of concern. I think the biggest thing that we're identifying here is the division between tutoring care and the welfare that one would expect around tutoring. So I think you will find that, a bit like, when the plumber comes into your house these days, they're absolutely amazing and they clean up and all the rest of it, and they know an awful lot, and they run their own business and talk to you in a very articulate way. Then while one obviously wants the tutor to come in and deliver some really core teaching, one also wants them to do that in the context of understanding your child and listening to your child. So yeah, I think in our experience, tutors all the time will say, today in the tutorial, so-and-so seemed a bit down, or they raised this with me and I said, thank you for saying that to me. You really need to go and talk to mum and dad about that. And I'm going to suggest to mum and dad that you open that dialogue. So we're looking for that level of sensitivity within it. We don't want tutors to become amateur psychologists and occupy the hour with all of that, but you will know as a parent the appropriate blend that you were looking for. And in terms of any guidance that we were offering in terms of tutorial support, we'd naturally look at all of that for you.
Fantastic, thank you. Now, just to go back on a point we were making earlier about the independence you gain when homeschooling, someone has asked whether the one-on-one tuition slightly undermines this as a concept.
I don't think it does. I understand where the question is coming from, in the sense that because it's one-to-one, you're directly focusing all of your attention on that individual. You're ensuring that the delivery, etc., is suitable for that individual. You're creating this sort of perfect approach for the individual, ideally. That doesn't mean you can't set them independent tasks. That doesn't mean that you can't expect them to deliver their homework on time. It doesn't mean that you can't set them projects to complete where you have little or no involvement. It doesn't mean that you can't flip the classroom so they teach you something as opposed to you teaching them something. It doesn't mean that you can't have an array of assessment activities in which, they are independently sharing their knowledge and demonstrating their understanding. I think what I probably mean by independence more generally is that because they're there on their own, invariably, they're taking more control over their learning and they are more independent as a consequence. Whereas when you're a student at a school, because you're going into classes with groups, you probably are less aware necessarily of this being your learning experience. Whereas when you're on your own, I think you're more aware that it is your own learning experience. And you're probably more aware of the responsibilities that you have in that learning experience to make sure that you get the most out of it. So I do think within the classroom anyway, there's lots of opportunity to be independent, and obviously tutors will exercise their skill to ensure that that's the case. But I think more generally also the kind of responsibility of turning up on time, if you're going to a particular venue, navigating, lots of homeschools will navigate transport, etc. on their own and do all of that sort of element. There is a bigger amount of responsibility. You don't have your friend going, oh, do we have prep for next Tuesday? That's incumbent on you to do that. And it also probably is incumbent on you to report back to your parents how things are going, this is what's happening, etc. And they'll be asking that of you. So I think as a consequence, our experience would be they do tend to become more independent. But I totally get the point that saying that because you're having one-to-one, is it more sort of spoon feeding? Do they become more dependent? I would suggest good tutors avoid that.
Nothing to add, Ed. 100% A star.
Fantastic. Well, we're nearing the end. We've just got two more questions we will address. So the first one is, given COVID, this sort of schools might be delayed reopening for international borders. Are there any options for online homeschooling for short periods of time, say just for the first half of term next term? And how might this work with time differences for international students? So Ed, I don't know if you want to start with that.
I wonder whether, Poppy, the question is best answered by you. I mean, what would you say to the answer to that question? Because obviously you put these homeschooling timetables together, and you know that. I'm assuming it's yes and yes. Yes,
exactly. We can definitely do short-term options, whether it's just for half term or even just a few weeks. We've done that in the past, and we're very aware that there are going to be lots of students requiring this help with the potential delay of schools opening. So that's absolutely possible. In terms of time differences, again, we work already with students all over the world. So our tutors can be very flexible on timings. And we can certainly put together timetables to suit the time differences which the students are encountering. So yes, absolutely.
I think it's also fair to say that where you are still at a school and wanting to stay at a school, but wanting to stay at a school in a way that's right, schools know they need to be sensitive in this next period to what works for families. This is a long relationship. Often a relationship with a family can occupy the best part of 20 years if there are 3 or 4 children involved. So they know that while they wanted to show leadership and say, we're doing it like this, so everybody get on board, they know that there are many things coming to play. And I've had a couple of the Chinese families I support where, you know, I'll spend an hour a week just sort of reviewing things with the parents or the child. You know, there's this real drag of a Zoom classroom that starts at, you know, sort of, you know, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock their time and finishes at 10, 11 at night. And schools have been sensitive. I said, just talk to school about it. Okay, yeah, that's all. Actually, that's non-essential. You don't really need to do it. But if you can zone in on these sessions, we'd be really appreciative. And schools have been terribly responsive to those children.
And actually on that, we can work very closely with the schools. We've done that in the past. So make sure that we are covering what the students can be missing and ensuring that they can go back whenever they're able to go back feeling completely on top of things and in line with their fellow pupils. Great. So one final question to finish on. Are there any specific pros or cons of homeschooling students with ADHD? I mean, this might be more towards Andy. We don't tend to have many tutors who are specialised in helping with students with ADHD.
Gosh, Poppy, I think we'd probably need another whole hour on that one. Because, I mean, obviously, we've seen it go through various curves over the last 20 years in terms of, you know, views on medication and all the rest of it. I think that I would just say I always move with extra care, just taking extra time over it to get it right. It's tremendously difficult, and I don't think we have a full understanding of where things are. I think that children with ADD and ADHD do respond extremely well to one-to-one, but all of those concerns about the bubble, all of those concerns about creating independence in the right way are magnified. But I think parents that are encountering that will have encountered many frustrations by the time they come to look at this, so they'll appreciate why you want to spend time to get it right. And yes, it's all doable, but just that extra level of care, I would say, for everybody.
My only addition to that would simply be that I think the more information parents can share from perhaps the experts that are working with their children, who perhaps maybe even the educational psychologists who may have diagnosed, they may also be receiving additional support in terms of skills to manage their difficulties. If there may be a medical support involved in some of these difficulties, ADHD, as Andy alluded to, some people can take medication, etc. So I think the more information you can provide to the tutor, I think is the better, really, because I think then they're able to better understand how the student operates. And then, as Andy says, you know, in a one-to-one environment, there is that opportunity to be really specific to the needs of the individual. So I think the more information that parents can share with the tutor, the better. We definitely have had experience with children with difficulties. It worked really well where you have, for example, somebody who may have a specialist training, and we don't always have access to those, but it may be they're receiving that outside of the tutoring environment, and then that person is communicating to the tutors, explaining, you know, look, perhaps take this tack or this approach or these sorts of things. So definitely, I think the one-to-one environment, there's a rule of thumb around special educational needs that tends to be quite a good environment for them, because there's less pressure, it's more focused on them. You know, you can understand how they work and then sort of teach to that, as it were. I would agree with all of that, but it doesn't negate the need for specialist care and attention necessarily. And I think the more information that tutors can get on that, the better, because invariably good tutors will adjust as much as they possibly can to make the learning as effective as possible for the individual they have in front of them, whether or not they have learning difficulties.
Yeah, it's where a good manager comes in. It's a great point, Ed, because obviously with a lot of these children, it has become multi-agency. And the real problem that I've encountered over the years is a kind of rock, scissors, paper, where there's about 10 parties involved, and it's up to the parent to somehow integrate all of that. But the parent is at the front end in terms of the frustrations that their child can be going through on a day-to-day or even an hour-to-hour basis. So that's where it can be important to have somebody that stands in as a kind of an overall director of it and says, okay, this is where the educational psychologist fits in, these are where the tutors fit in, and so on, and starts to help you organise that. And that in many ways can be the biggest factor about making it work. Because the problem with ADHD students I've found is that because of the frustrations they feel, they can actually be divisive. So they will not always work themselves to help coordinate. And so we have to help them with that as well. We have to be responsive to that and not be frustrated by that. So I think that's very important with multi-agency. Yeah.
There's been a really good comment on, I think, on the Q&A. You know, obviously all of the allowances would be made with regards to, you know, and good tutors, as I think this person is a tutor, said, you know, ADHD respond very well to one-to-one. I think dyslexics, dyspraxics, or, you know, and students who don't have learning difficulty respond very well to one-to-one. And I think the breaks, this tutor's recommending lots more breaks, more movement within teaching. I totally agree with that. And yeah, I think it can work very, very well. I guess these kinds of recommendations can come out of educational psychologist reports. And as a consequence, if a tutor's being provided with that, who may be a really, really good tutor, but perhaps hasn't had lots of experience with ADHD, you know, I'm sure they can act on that kind of feedback. But as you know, just citing this tutor's experience, that there are tutors out there that have a lot of experience of working with students who've got learning difficulties. So I think generally I would say around learning difficulties, it's a really positive experience, one-to-one and homeschooling. But I would say that transferring information from the experts to tutors is a really integral part to that, to ensure that the learning is as geared towards that individual as best. And that could be short breaks, that could be different types of activities, etc. So I think the more information that can be transferred, the better, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much, Andy, for joining us and for sharing your views. That was really fantastic.
And may I just say one more little thing?
Yeah, of course.
I just wrote this down yesterday when I was just thinking about things, because it was such a compendious topic, and I hope it's been helpful for parents. And it's interesting because something Ed said a while ago, which I was just laughing because I'd written down, just to get parents started, I think these are the 3 key questions that you should ask yourself if you are thinking about homeschooling. Number 1, why isn't school working? And really identify what that is. Number 2, how might school work? What might it take to change it? And then number 3, what might constitute a compromise? And I think, Ed, that's precisely what you were picking up about 10 minutes ago in terms of this whole dialogue with things.
No, I think I think you need to address the issue of school first before you look at homeschooling. That would be my recommendation. And obviously it may be that it's very quick to address those issues. It just may be clear that it's not the right place for that child. But I think you need to address those things first, speak to the school, try to see how much flexibility there is. And then obviously, as we've had lots of questions to different people who are experts, also tutoring, advisors in special educational needs, etc. You know, on our webinar, there are lots of help out there. So I think you can then navigate that to ensure that you put, you know, the most appropriate and comprehensive program together for your child.
Absolutely. Well, this recording will be available on our website shortly, so do please share it around and get in contact with us if you've got any other questions or anything you'd like to discuss, would like to discuss potential homeschooling for your child. And thank you very much for joining.
Thanks very much, Poppy.
Thank you very much, Poppy.
Thank you both.